the Gospel of John, chapter 5. It was because Jesus did things like this on the Sabbath that the Jewish leaders began to harass him. His answer to them was, "My Father still goes on working, and so I am at work also." How very unfortunate any human being who faces each day literally dreading the work before him or her. A receptionist says, "I often don't want to get out of bed. I dread Friday because Monday then looms over me. Another 5 days, there never seems to be any end of it. Why am I doing this? Yet I dread trying to find another job." An airline representative comments, "My job is so very routine, I hate it with a passion. Even if I feel sick in the morning, going to work, feeling, oh God, I've got to go." A model laments, "I feel guilty because I think people should do something they really like in life. I should do something else. It's not very fulfilling, but I admit it, I'm lazy." A banker says the job is boring. It's a real repetitious thing. The hours drag by. It's always the same. Nothing exciting ever happens. I talked once with the owner of a major corporation, and he volunteered the opinion that many in his place feel basically trapped in a job or career that they would not have chosen had they known back then what they know now. Another man says, "I've met a few people in my time who were enthusiastic about hard work. And it was just my luck that all of them happened to be people that I was working for at the time." So last week we enjoyed a holiday celebrating our work. Papers were full of stories, did you notice, about those who revel in, or reviled their jobs? And the day after, we all went back to work again, did we not? How is it with you? How do you feel about the job you go to, the tasks, that is, that wait for you in home or marketplace or community, the lists of things that must be done? Burst out of bed in the morning, enthusiastic, can't wait to get at it, no resistance, no regrets. If so, get down on your knees and thank God. But could it feel a tad more meaningful, more life-giving? If you encountered someone whose work was his very food, the thing that kept him going, the source of meaning and energy for his days, wouldn't you stop and take a second look at him? Ask, what's going on here? Well, in the chapter just before the text I read, the disciples are stewing about Jesus. He's been skipping meals, and so like good Jewish mothers, they beg him, "Please eat." To which he responds with words that puzzle, "I have food to eat that you don't know anything about." They mumble among themselves, "What's going on here? Has somebody been smuggling him sack lunches behind our backs?" Jesus sees their bewilderment and clears up the mystery. "My food is to do the will of him who sent me, finishing the work that he has given me." Interesting, unlike the picture of God in a lot of other perspectives, as immobile or passive, sitting up there, waiting for prayers to come in, uninvolved in the everyday life of this physical world, the God of Jesus is a working God. The Sabbath rest at the end of his creation of the world did not issue in a retreat from work, from the affairs of his children. "My Father still goes on working," he retorts to those who harass him for healing on Sunday. "My Father still goes on working, and so I go on working also." So for Jesus, in sum, the only life worth living is in main a productive life, the life expended on something larger than his own needs, the life of real work alongside his working Father. It's quite astonishing how often in the Gospel of John he talks about his work. He speaks about all the work that God has given him to do, and at the end of his story, if you remember, he talks about having finished that work. Now, out of this old story, by way of Luther, and especially Calvin, there came to the West something that we've learned to call the work ethic. "Bred into our bones," my father said, "Gil, if you don't learn how to work, you'll never amount to anything." On our trip to southern Spain last June, a copy of the International Herald Tribune made its way very quickly through the group. It spoke of the demise of this commitment to work in Europe. whereas, quote, in the pious, industrious U.S., the Protestant work ethic is alive and well. Americans, it said, work 2,000 hours a year, give or take. Remember those hard-working Germans? They barely work 1,500 hours a year. Americans average about 10 days of vacation each year. Europeans take off 6 to 7 weeks of vacation every year. There is actually a group now in Berlin called the Freiwillige Arbeitslos, the free will unemployed, those who choose it. This is a partial explanation, said the article, for the success of our economy over the past decades and our well-being in this country in comparison to the problems that Europe is having. But even more interesting, it went on, the decline of work in Northern Europe has occurred more or less simultaneously with the decline of the Protestant faith. In the Netherlands, Britain, Germany, Sweden, Denmark, less than 10% of the population attend church even once a month. In a recent Gallup survey over there, 49% of Danes, 52% of Norwegians, 55% of Swedes. The numbers are about the same for Germany and Holland and Austria. They said that God really does not matter to them in their lives. Here in America, conversely, 82% of respondents said God is very important in their daily life. So it's important that we preserve this way of seeing and understanding life. Life is labor, creating, producing, giving out to the best of our capacity, to our fullest of our own particular gifts, as long as God gives us breath on this earth. Because our commitment to our labor is shaped not so much by what we do as by how we view what we must do. If we see our daily tasks and chores as only something to be gotten through so that we can get on to the real life beyond, the real life of leisure, we will begin to chafe under them if we're not careful. If we see them as central, however, to the purpose of our being here, we will bear even the boredom and drudgery with a far different spirit. But how can we see our work as full of purpose and grandeur, however dull and routine it sometimes gets? The work that Jesus talks about, invites us to share, certainly doesn't sound like receptionist, airline rep, model, banker, mother. So how do we get into his kind of work? Hang around the church all the time? Serve on 2 more committees? God so loved the world that he did not send a committee. Seek to convert those we encounter to our brand of faith. There are those for whom that's a central passion. Head for seminary and all become priests and ministers. Can you imagine what this world would be like if even half of us were priests and ministers? One layman tells how he was invited to an ecumenical convention of all clergy. Said he'd never been so uncomfortable and self-conscious in his life. When the priest seated next to him passed the bread basket, he put $1 in it. In his latter chapters to Rome, Paul writes, "Greet Prisca and Aquila who work with me. Greet Mary, who has worked very hard among you. Greet Urbanus, our co-worker. Greet those workers in the Lord, Tryphena und Tryphosa." There's some new biblical names for your next child or grandchild if you're in need. Greet the beloved Persis, who has worked hard. Now, do you really think that these were all full-time preachers? No, the work that God is talking about, the work to which he gave his life, the work to which he calls us, is the work to be done within the framework of the tasks and obligations that we already face every day, whether it be mothering or manufacturing or hospice volunteer or professional career. And what is that work? It is the work of planting the beginnings of God's kingdom in this world. Put differently, it is the introduction of the spirit and rule of God's love into the disease and darkness and loneliness and brokenness and contradictions of just this kind of world. Jesus' work involved and involves the passionate and compassionate struggle to make this world a bit more a reflection of what God intends it to be, and by his grace will one day make it to be. That's the task for which he felt sent. And that is the task that he invites us to share in our admittedly limited ways each day, a task we ought to share in the midst of carrying out our own labors and responsibilities. So you see, Jesus' work ought to give us a new perspective on our own work. His work invites us to see our work not just as means of personal survival or outlet for our own ambitions or a way to take care of our kids toward the future, all important, but followers of the Christ are invited to see the place where they are and the jobs they do and the people with whom they relate as their opportunity to help shape the kind of world that God wants and that Christ came to set into motion. I'm talking, of course, not just about the so-called employed. In many ways, one of the great personal tragedies and social problems of the moment is all those people who are unemployed, who do not have gainful employment, we say. Especially so because not only is that an economic problem for them personally, but in our kind of culture, it means the loss of discipline and socialization, and above all, a sense of meaning. And we ought to care about that question. But every human being, even the unemployed or officially retired, needs to believe that God still has purpose for their days. Many retired friends comment that they're busier now than ever before, and I'm surrounded by them. In fact, I'm one of the few in the midst of the whole pack, if you know where I'm living. One of them says the only difference is that you never know when you're retired. You never know what day it is, what time it is, where you're supposed to be, or what you're supposed to be doing. It's a lot like working for the government. So Christ's work gives us, first of all, a new perspective on our work, seeing our tasks in a different light, as more than paychecks, seeing them as a place where the kingdom seeks to break through in this world, where Christ's Spirit may better reign, the spirit of integrity, think Enron, the spirit of excellence, the spirit of selflessness and compassion, the spirit of building, the spirit of healing. Working the work of Jesus does not necessarily mean doing anything different than you're doing, but it does mean doing it with a different spirit and eyes, with a different end in view than getting to TGIF. I'm convinced that the kingdom we pray for Sunday after Sunday, thy kingdom come on earth, the rule of God's will and love in our world is in our day our job. It's less and less a matter of chatter from pulpit and formal propaganda, and more a matter of lives who seek to live by His Spirit. The integrity of faith in our time depends not so much upon argument or emotional manipulation, but upon real people of faith who live productive and caring lives, disciplined and self-giving, joyous and purposeful. The credibility of faith today depends upon men and women who will make their workplace, whether it be home or office or shop or street, a place where His work also gets done. Of course, you may run the risk of mystifying the secular mind if you labor like that. I read a while ago of a young man, determined and purposeful, who was eager to go to work, who was first in the office every morning and often last to leave, and who rarely took a day off, and who slaved through the lunch hour if asked and never complained and was always buoyant and optimistic. And one day the boss called him into his office, and the young man waited rather apprehensively to hear what the boss would say. And the boss said, "Jim, I've been watching your work lately very carefully. What the devil are you up to?" Marvelous old legend about St. Francis. Brother Juniper says to St. Francis, "Teach me to preach as eloquently as you. I'm not good with words." "I'll teach you to preach more eloquently than I do," said St. Francis. "Meet me tomorrow and I shall teach you to preach." Brother Juniper dutifully met Francis early the next morning, and to Juniper's surprise, they began walking. They walked through the marketplace, they smiled at the laborers, the children, they patted the kids on the head, they helped carry an old woman carry her wash up a set of stairs. They walked, and finally an exasperated Brother Juniper asked, "Francis, when do we begin the preaching lessons?" Replied the saint, "Why, what do you think we've been doing?" Someone once said, Preach the gospel of God's love. Use words if necessary. Tell me, is there no one with whom you labor or live who does not need an example of commitment to excellence? Is there no one whom you serve who does not need the impact of a gracious and affirming interest? Is there no one with whom you deal in your everyday who does not need the feel of real honesty and integrity? Is there no one beside you who does not need encounter with a courageous and hopeful spirit? You see, this perspective on our present labors and tasks and lives enables us a new sense of what we're about here. It opens up our imagination to new meaning within old duties. And it need not be on a grand scale to shine with the purpose of God. In a culture where very essential contributions, very essential, are often undervalued and unrecognized, we all need to take every opportunity we can to affirm the meaning of all contribution, prominent or private, applauded or unappreciated. Two men were helping rehab an old house in the city to make it livable for a family in need. And writes the one of them, because the water was off, we left in the morning and took along our own supply. One hot afternoon, we were just enjoying our drinks, and then finally we're returning to the ladders when a boy, maybe 10 years old, rode up on his bike. We could see that he was limited, that he only had one arm. I live down the block a ways, he said. Mom sent me to see if you guys need some drinking water. If you do, I can go back and get some. I started to explain that, no, we brought our own water, but my partner very quickly interrupted and said, you came in the nick of time. A cup of cold water would do wonders for the both of us. As the lad got back on his bike, a big grin swept across his face. I'll be right back, he promised. You're lucky I came along. Now our worries are over, my friend shouted after him. We got another man on the job. For days I wondered why I hadn't answered his question as my partner had, affirming imaginatively. Why hadn't I recognized the boy's urgent need to be needed? With a few well-chosen words, my friend had transformed a small boy into a lad of real purpose. And one might cynically say, well, what difference does that really make in the larger scheme of things? But I seem to hear a voice saying that not even a cup of cold water goes without impact, without reward. You see, the coming of God's kingdom on earth depends not on the brilliance of a few great men or their power or upon dramatically impressive actions. I think it is rather a tidal wave of accumulative power created by the combined actions of countless ordinary people like us, who day by day seek to reflect the Spirit of their Lord as they go about their tasks, and it gathers momentum as it rolls along until it lifts everything in its path to new heights of power and reality. But we're always a day away from losing the sense of the glory in the daily. But we can regain it again and again as we learn to see the place where we are with His perspective as the place where the most important work in the world awaits us. Learn to look for new purpose right in the old routine. And if we do, we will discover that, like Jesus, the tasks and chores and duties of each day become our daily bread, that which makes life not only meaningful, but a source of energy and power. It's always a strange thing how a task conceived of as great can lift a person above physical limitations and little strength. Lord Wilberforce, who was not as important as his name sounds when he started out on his cause, whose lifelong struggle in the British Parliament finally led to the liberation of the slaves, was a small, insignificant appearing, ailing creature. And at first, when he was elected to the House of Commons and would arise to address them on the subject which had become a passion of his own heart, the members would smile at this queer little unrealistic creature fighting alone a hopeless battle. But you know, as his speeches wore on over the years and the fire and the power began to pour from the lips and hearts of this single dedicated human being, convinced that he was doing the work of God, they began to crowd the benches under the incredible impact of his force and strength, until one of his colleagues said of him, "What do you know, the little minnow has become a whale." Henry Van Dyke, "Let me but do my work from day to day in field or forest or desk or loom, in roaring marketplace or tranquil room. Let me but find it in my heart to say, when vagrant wishes beckon me astray, this is my work, my blessing, not my doom. Of all who live, I am the one by whom this work can best be done in the right way. Then shall I see it not too great nor small to suit my spirit and to prove my powers. Then shall I cheerful greet the laboring hours, and cheerful turn when long shadows fall at eventide to play and love and rest, because I know for me my work is best. My work is doing the work of him who sent me, and so is yours." Amen.